From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The truth is that they called us essential workers. But I want to ask, are we essential to them just when we make them their profits?
Essential workers denied government aid during the pandemic. Some, because of their immigration status, have entered their third week on hunger strike to demand assistance. We'll speak to New York Assembly member Marcela Martinez, who joined the hunger strike 11 days ago. Then we look at pandemic profiteering in the medical system. As nonprofit hospitals take in billions in COVID relief aid, why are patients being sued over unpaid medical bills during a pandemic? And why are hospitals charging up to $3,000 for a COVID test? We'll speak to Elizabeth Benjamin of the Community Service Society of New York.
We have to have a moratorium on all medical debt brought by nonprofit hospitals that rake in billions a year in federal and state funding.
Then, as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen calls for a global minimum tax on corporations, we look at President Biden's more than $2 trillion infrastructure proposal.
It's a once-in-a-generation investment in our economic future, a chance to win the future, paid for by asking big corporations, many of which do not pay any taxes at all, just to begin to pay their fair share.
We'll speak to Derek Hamilton, founder of the New Schools Institute on Race and Political Economy. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Minnesota, the doctor who tried to save George Floyd's life at a Minneapolis emergency room last May testified Monday asphyxia was the likely cause of Floyd's death, with no evidence Floyd was killed by a heart attack or drug overdose. Dr. Bradford Langenfeld's testimony came as the second week of former police officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial got underway. Also testifying was Minneapolis Police Chief Arredondo, who told prosecutors Chauvin violated department policies and showed a disregard for life when he kneeled on George Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. It was a rare instance of a police chief testifying against a former officer.
But once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy. It is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Police Chief Arredondo is among a number of high-ranking law enforcement officials who've condemned Derek Chauvin's actions during the trial. Yet Chauvin racked up 18 complaints over his 19-year career as a police officer, raising questions about why he remained on active duty at the time of George Floyd's killing. The United States reported over 79,000 new coronavirus infections Monday as cases continue to rise nationwide, led by soaring rates of infection in Michigan. In Montana, Republican Governor Greg Gianforte, who ended a statewide mask mandate in February and pushed local governments to drop COVID-19 restrictions, has tested positive for coronavirus. Governor Gianforte received his first dose of Pfizer vaccine 4 days before his positive test result, which came a day after he attended Easter Sunday services at Grace Bible Church in Bozeman. In Waco, Texas, thousands of college students who'd gathered in Baylor University's football stadium to watch the NCAA basketball finals rushed the field Monday night after their team won the national championship. The students packed together for celebrations, few of them wearing masks. Meanwhile, in Arlington, Texas, over 38,000 fans packed the home opener of the Texas Rangers Major League Baseball team Monday. The Rangers said masks were required, but the rule was widely flouted. It was the first time in over a year that any professional sports team in the U.S. has allowed its stadium to fill to capacity. As of Monday, just 16% of Texas residents had been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Florida has become the latest state to open vaccinations to everyone 16 and older. The move follows accusations that Republican Governor Ron DeSantis prioritized wealthy communities that were connected to political donors for vaccination pop-up sites. The Biden administration has set up its own federally run vaccination sites in Florida's biggest cities to combat what it says are racial disparities in vaccine distribution. This is White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
17% of Florida's population is African American, but less than 7% of vaccinations have gone to African Americans in the state. That's one of the reasons that we opened 4 FEMA sites in Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville, and Orlando. And these sites disproportionately serve communities of color.
Ukraine has tightened public health measures as a surge of COVID-19 cases is threatening to overwhelm hospitals. It's part of a massive wave of coronavirus infections sweeping Europe and Latin America. Saudi Arabia says it'll open Islam's holiest site in Mecca to pilgrims throughout the month of Ramadan, but only to those who've been vaccinated against COVID-19 or who've recovered from the disease. Public health agencies are warning Haiti has yet to receive a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine for its 11 million people, with further delays now likely to postpone a scheduled first shipment of vaccines due to arrive in May. The Pan American Health Organization says Haiti's government failed to apply for a pilot program that would have sped up deliveries of doses under the UN's COVAX initiative. Haiti remains in deep political turmoil after U.S.-backed Jovenel Moïse refused to leave office after a 5-year term as required by Haiti's constitution. In February, the Biden administration sided with Moïse's claim that he can serve for another year. The Biden administration's lifted Trump-era sanctions imposed on International Criminal Court prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and another top ICC official for the court's investigation into U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, however, reaffirmed U.S. opposition to the probe as well as to the ICC's investigation into Israeli war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel's president has given Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a chance to form a coalition government after elections in March failed to produce a clear winner for the 4th consecutive round of voting. This comes as Netanyahu's corruption trial has opened at a district court in Jerusalem. Netanyahu is accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. On Monday, the former CEO of an online news site testified he was ordered by the company's owner to drop negative stories about Netanyahu and to trash his rivals. Prosecutors say in exchange, Netanyahu enacted regulatory decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the owner. Netanyahu is also accused of trying to push tax breaks to benefit an Israeli billionaire movie producer after receiving gifts from him, including expensive cigars and champagne. Netanyahu has repeatedly lashed out at reports over corruption, calling them fake news.
This is how they try to overthrow a powerful prime minister from the right. This is what an attempt at a coup looks like.
Back in the United States, Senate Democrats have unveiled a plan to overhaul the U.S. taxes on corporations more than 3 years after President Trump and Republican lawmakers cut the top corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. On Monday, West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin said he opposes a White House plan to raise the corporate tax to 28%, saying he might be open to a partial rollback of Trump's corporate tax cut to 25%. Manchin's a key swing vote in the evenly divided Senate. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called Monday for a minimum global corporate income tax to help pay for President Biden's proposed $2.25 trillion infrastructure and jobs plan. This comes as a new study finds at least 55 of the wealthiest U.S. corporations, including FedEx, Duke Energy, and Nike, paid $0 in taxes last year on tens of billions of dollars in profits. Arkansas Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson has vetoed a bill that would have criminalized doctors providing gender-affirming treatment to transgender youths following massive pressure from activists against the legislation. The governor spoke from Little Rock Monday.
House Bill 1570 would put the state as the definitive oracle of medical care, overriding parents, patients, and healthcare experts. While in some instances the state must act to protect life, the state should not presume to jump into the middle of every medical, human, and ethical issue. This would be and is a vast government overreach.
This bill could still become law if Arkansas's legislature votes to override the governor's veto. Republican lawmakers in at least 17 other states are considering similar bills. This comes just a month after Governor Hutchinson signed a bill into law aimed at banning trans women and girls from participating in sports. Meanwhile, Virginia has become the first state in the South to ban individuals charged with killing LGBTQ people from using so-called gay and trans panic as a defense for lesser charges or a reduced sentence. The legal defense has allowed individuals accused of murder or manslaughter to argue that the victim's gender identity or sexual orientation was what provoked them to commit the crime. The legislation was introduced by Virginia House Delegate Danica Roem, who became the first transgender lawmaker elected to a state legislature. And in Missouri, people incarcerated at a St. Louis jail led another uprising Sunday protesting the facility's inhumane conditions during the pandemic and demanding an end to cash bail and for court hearings to be resumed. Videos posted on social media show prisoners standing in front of broken windows, yelling and holding signs that read, "Help us." Others lit small fires and chanted their demands to people outside the jail. This is at least the fourth uprising at the St. Louis City Justice Center since December, according to the Associated Press. Missouri State Rep. Rasheed Aldrich Jr. said in a statement, quote, "The detainees are being held without trial and unable to pay their bail, causing a system that disproportionately puts poor and black people behind bars. If we care about justice, these systems need to change," unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, more than a year into the pandemic and the economic crisis it generated, many workers continue to be excluded from receiving any government relief. These excluded workers include undocumented people, many of them in essential services, and people recently released from prison. Well, on Monday in New York, hundreds of excluded workers from across the state marched to the capital of Albany in a final push to demand lawmakers support a $3.5 billion fund that would be the first of its kind in the United States to provide financial relief and health care to those shut out of the current system. Embattled Governor Andrew Cuomo is now in final negotiations with legislators on a budget bill that was due last month. New York Assemblymember Marcela Martinez has joined excluded workers in a weeks-long hunger strike urging support for the fund. She addressed Monday's rally.
There is plenty of money. What there isn't is political courage to do the right thing.
A Democratic majority controls both legislative houses in New York, and Governor Cuomo is a Democrat. If passed, the state's Excluded Workers Fund could issue payments to as many as 275,000 people. Advocates say Governor Cuomo is pushing for a two-tiered system of access to the fund that would require burdensome proof of employment requirements for people who may not have access to bank records and pay stubs or other forms of identification. These are hunger-striking workers Ana Ramirez and Felipe Adrovo.
So
There are many excluded workers, not just me. We're thousands of families. We're babysitters, domestic workers, construction workers, street vendors.
I lost my job last March. After 8 years, my brother passed away. I was in the hospital with COVID. I lost my apartment in Woodside. I'm here to raise my voice and the voice of others. I'm in this fight in memory of my brother.
For more, we're joined by New York Assembly member Marcela Matenes, who, as we reported, is on hunger strike with the excluded workers. Before her election last year, she spent a decade as a tenant organizer. She immigrated to the United States from Peru with her family when she was a child, and many of her constituents are excluded workers. She's also calling for a wealth tax. We'll get into it all. Assembly member, thanks so much for joining us. You're in what, your 11th, 12th day of a hunger strike, and the other people who, some in wheelchairs, rolled through the Capitol yesterday are in the third week. There are 21 days of hunger strike. Talk about what you're demanding.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. We're asking for $3.5 billion. That would be in par with what other New York State employees have received in unemployment benefits and also in stimulus assistance. So we're asking for folks that weren't able to qualify for any federal or state assistance to be compensated in this way. For the money to be retroactive to April 2020 through September of this year, when the benefits are supposed to continue. And so what we're asking is to give folks an opportunity who are trying to get out of this pandemic, like we all are, who are facing obstacles that nobody expected, who are suffering at no fault of their own. I truly believe that this is the job of government. We're supposed to provide for our people. And this is a moment where we need to step up.
Well, Assemblywoman Matenes, how would the Excluded Workers Fund function, given the fact that many of the folks, as has been noted, are not necessarily in the employment system per se, in terms of verification, in terms of the number of children in their family? How would this fund work from your understanding of it?
So what we're hearing, and we're still, we're still trying to fight this, is it's a two-tier system. The first tier getting the bulk of the money, but they have to have an ITN number. They have to prove, they were employed. They want pay stubs, a letter for an employee, all things that are going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to produce. And the second tier, who can't produce the things, are going to get a very small amount. And so it just doesn't seem right that at the time when the city was asked to shut down, when people of privilege were able to shelter in place, that folks that didn't have any other options, that needed to continue working, did, that were exposed, that then got sick. It's just not right, and it's not fair that they're not given an opportunity to fight this pandemic as well. And so to me, the fact that folks have gone on 21 days of a hunger strike to try and call attention to this immense need, folks haven't received any type of assistance for over a year. And these are families with children, family with elders. And so what's ended up happening is communities have had to step in. And what we've seen is mutual aids come into place and try and provide and help where the government has failed. And so for those people that are on hunger strike for 21 days, who are doing this not just for themselves, but for all their immigrant neighbors throughout the state of New York, it would just be a real shame that they would not be able to qualify for the assistance that they truly need. And the way that I look at this is not just giving them money, but this is an investment in our community, investment in our future, because they will then take the money and put it back into the economy, which is what we need. And this is a way that we can all begin to work together and thrive and get back on our feet.
And how has Governor Cuomo responded to this, especially given the fact of obviously he was citing a huge budget deficit in the coming years, but then there was quite a bit of financial aid that came in President Biden's recovery plan. What's your sense of how the governor is responding to the budget impact of these, not only of this, but the rest of the budget that needs to be passed, should have been passed by April 1?
It should have been passed, yes. Let's understand that this governor has passed austerity budgets, and that's 10 years of budget cuts to truly important services and programs that hurt our most needy. And so his original proposal did not include a single dime for these excluded workers. And so what we're doing is negotiating. And so we're hopeful. The legislator had also proposed 6 different bills to tax the rich that together would comprehensively change not just the progressive tax system, but over time would start chipping away at that income inequality. And so what we're seeing is options on the table that are not fully being considered. What we're seeing is where the governor's priority is, because what he is pushing through is a $1.3 billion project for Penn Station, where he's talking about building 10 office towers. I'm not sure how the people of the state of New York, who are still hurting, who are still in need, who still need much, much more, are going to take to this budget with this proposal in it. And I'm very concerned.
I want to go to Reina, an undocumented worker and activist with the immigrant rights group Make the Road. The group held a rally last month.
I am scared right now because I owe 2 months of rent, and the landlord has been knocking on my door. I tell him, wait, but he says, for how long? I am going to take you to court. And in all truth, I am very scared because I am struggling. I have a job for every 8 days, working, making $80, and I can't live off $80. I am a household cleaner. I am excluded from government support, and so that has a big impact on me because I am a mother of 2 children.
Assemblymember Martinez, I have a friend who went to get a vaccine shot as a bodega delivery person, and they came up to him online and said, show me your pay stubs from the bodega. And he said, when was the last time you saw a pay stub from a bodega? And they actually laughed. Ultimately, they let him go through. But this issue of documentation and what is needed in all aspects of life, and also this woman talking about rent, your history before you were an assemblywoman is as a crusading tenant organizer after your family lost their own home in Queens. Can you talk about that and how that fits into this picture?
Yes. Actually, we lost our home in Sunset Park, where I continue to live, and it's part of the community that I represent. You know, I deeply believe that housing is a human right. At the time that I got displaced, my daughter was 8 years old, the only home that she knew, and I had to sit down to her and explain to her what was happening. And that year, she learned 2 vocabulary words. She learned gentrification and she learned eviction. You know, people don't understand how violent being evicted is and the trauma that instills in you and how you carry that with you. And so, you know, it breaks my heart to hear what's happening, although I'm also just very used to it. You know, we're hearing things where landlords are telling tenants they don't care that the governor has put an eviction moratorium. That's their property and they need their money. They're being told you have credit cards, use your credit cards. And so what we're trying to do is really what we should be focusing on is providing basics so that folks can get back on their feet, because what they want to do more than anything else is to be able to get back to work and pay their bills. But they can't do that right now. And I think that it's morally wrong for us to ask these people to work during the pandemic and then now tell them that we can't assist you, we can't help you because you don't have the proper paperwork.
Assemblywoman, I wanted to ask you, you recently wrote an op-ed piece in the Independent in New York where you talked about the the root of inequality in our state being a regressive system of taxation. Could you talk about the initiatives that are being attempted in this budget to change that by some of the more progressive Democrats in the state?
Yes, so I mentioned that there is a comprehensive approach that we were trying to push, and it's 6 pieces of legislation that would begin to change the income inequality. And one of the things that I'm pushing in particularly is a change in the constitutional amendment that would allow us the ability to tax intangible wealth. And so what's happening right now is that because the state is not able to collect it doesn't have sufficient revenue for its expenses, and it can only collect so much in tax, that it really leans on the city to be able to fill in that gap. And so what we see and what I'm hearing, and I heard this over and over and over again through my campaign, was, this issue about property taxes. And it's just gotten so out of control that it's become a huge problem. And so every time we talk about taxing the rich, we get these lies and these rhetorics and this pushback about the fact that the rich are going to leave. The rich left the city during the pandemic and went to their second home in the Hamptons. Let's be clear about who's leaving. The people that are leaving are working class New Yorkers, middle class New Yorkers that can no longer afford their property tax, that are tired of sending their children to schools that are underfunded, that are tired of the expensive health costs, transportation costs, and the continued budget cuts through this governor of much needed social services. And so what we should be focusing on, and what this legislation, along with the rest of the legislation, was really trying to tackle, is we were proposing 6 pieces of legislation that together would bring in $50 billion of revenue for the first year, and really setting down the foundation for ongoing revenue so that we can finally fully fund all the services that we need and start reinvesting in our communities, because we all deserve to live in communities that are flourishing, not just folks that have money.
Marcela Martinez, I want to thank you so much for being with us, New York Assembly member on hunger strike, along with other excluded workers. Before she won election last year, she spent a decade as a tenant organizer, immigrating from Peru with her family when she was a child. Next up, we look at pandemic profiteers in the medical system, the nonprofit hospitals taking in billions in COVID relief and suing patients over unpaid $500 medical bills during the pandemic. Also, we'll look at while some charge up to $3,000 for a COVID test. Stay with us. A mariachi band singing La Bamba in solidarity with the excluded workers' protest in New York. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As the United States reports over 79,000 new coronavirus infections Monday, and cases continue to rise nationwide, even with the vaccines. We turn now to look at pandemic profiteering in the medical system. A new report by Kaiser Health News reveals some of the nation's richest hospitals recorded hundreds of millions of dollars in surplus over the past year after accepting federal health care bailout grants. In Texas, the state's largest nonprofit hospital system, Baylor Scott & White Health, received over $450 million in relief funds despite laying off 1,200 workers. Baylor's now sitting on a surplus of appropriate I should cough during a healthcare segment. The report cited the Mayo Clinic, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and NYU Langone Health as other big beneficiaries. Here in New York, the state's largest nonprofit health system, Northwell, received $1.2 billion in federal funds from the CARES Act. But Northwell, which is run by a close ally of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, has faced intense criticism for suing over 2,500 patients last year for failing to pay their medical bills. It only stopped suing for medical debt after a report by the Community Service Society exposed the practice. Meanwhile, the New York Times recently revealed one of Northwell's facilities, the Lenox Hill Hospital, billed over $3,000 for COVID tests, more than 30 times the typical cost. We're joined now by Elizabeth Benjamin, Vice President of Health Initiatives at the Community Service Society of New York, co-founder of Healthcare for All New York campaign. Elizabeth, can you start off by talking about these pandemic profiteers? Why don't you start off by talking about Northwell and what happened as patients were in such dire circumstances this year? The hospital sued thousands of them.
Yes. So I think it's really important to note that 2/3 of all hospitals in America are nonprofit hospitals. In New York State, every single hospital by law is a nonprofit 501c3 charity. And we have to remember that the first tenet of medicine is to do no harm. There's a lot of talk in our healthcare system about putting patients first and social determinants of health, but this is not doing that. This is not taking care of patients first. Suing patients ruins their lives. It means you have to make decisions between paying your rent or paying a medical bill, putting food on your table or paying a medical bill. I think what our work has shown, and we've looked now at every single hospital in New York State and found that they have collectively sued over 50,000 patients, despite all being charities, and over 5,000 patients during the pandemic, is that there's a deep problem here with our so-called not-for-profit hospitals. And I think we really need to take stock as a country and say, look, either you get to be a charity and you get to raise money and not pay taxes and pull down billions of dollars. For example, $178 billion in CARES Act funding went to hospitals during the pandemic. You can get all that, but you must not sue your patients. Suing your patients hurts them.
Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this whole issue of this, the enormous money that the hospitals have made. I did a deep dive into the finances here in New Jersey of the largest hospital chain, RWJ Barnabas, and I discovered that they received about $1.2 billion in grants and loans from the federal government, far more than they lost in patient revenues. During last year, as a result of CARES Act funding, at the same time, they were making huge gains in their investment portfolios as a result of the tremendous drive up in the market. So they are sitting in far more. It's almost like the coronavirus became a financial windfall for the hospital, so opposed, as you say, nonprofit corporations. The federal government even gave them advanced Medicare reimbursements, which was basically a loan, a zero-interest loan for these hospitals. And so how are they able to get away with this?
So I think the issue is, look, we want hospitals, right? We're so grateful to the staff and everybody that works at hospitals for helping us to survive this horrible pandemic. In New York, our nonprofit hospitals got well over $13 billion in CARES Act funding. And, you know, most of the hospitals in New York, I don't believe, ended up with the exception of NYU and a few others, with huge surpluses by the end of the year. And perhaps that's because New York was hit so hard by the pandemic. My concern is if we're going to invest our public dollars and our public good into hospitals, what business do they have in suing patients? And let's just talk about what happens with these lawsuits. Most patients, you know, are sued, and what happens is there's a default judgment. If you look at Lenox Hill, for example, the hospital with the $3,000 CARES corona test, they sue patients. They sue patients for about $1,900. That's the median amount that they're suing for. So they're suing patients for not very much, for in terms of their huge surpluses. They have nearly $100 million surplus, and they're suing patients for about $1,900. Altogether, they're suing patients. They get 34 times more in their annual surplus than they get in what they're suing for patients over 5 years. So what's going on here? They're ruining patients' lives while reaping, you know, surpluses and revenue. This is not the way to pay for health care, by suing your patients. That's the problem here. And so, you know, I think we as a country need to really look at how we're supporting nonprofit hospitals. If we're going to be investing billions of dollars in them through CARES Act funding, through Medicare, through Medicaid, then I think we have the right to demand certain practices just be dropped. And the first practice that should be dropped is suing low-income patients of color. And I think what's really important is to understand that LendingTree said that 72% of the people that they surveyed said that medical debt prevents them from achieving their major milestones in life. 40% of people of color have medical debt. 137 million Americans have medical debt in 2019, before the pandemic. We really need to have some political action here that says, if you're a nonprofit hospital, your first tenet is to do no harm. And I think that's a reasonable expectation. I mean, after all, it was the public outcry that stopped the Humane Society from killing the animals. Hospitals should not be suing their patients. That should be a never event. It should be approved by the CFO and the board of directors if they must sue at all.
And Elizabeth, aren't most hospitals, because they are nonprofits and charities, required to do indigent care to a certain degree and get reimbursed by the state governments for their charity care? How do you reconcile this issue of their having to have some public good as a result of being a charity, and yet they're continuing to sue as would any for-profit company?
I can't reconcile it. In New York State, we give our hospitals $1 billion in what's called indigent care pool funding or charity care pool funding, and yet altogether they're suing people for, you know, a couple $10 million. So in each year, it makes no sense. And when we review the pleadings, because we go to court and we pull all the court case files, for example, at Lenox Hill, we found not one offer of financial assistance was actually made or attested to in their court documents. And the documents that they use when they sue people, they use sort of creepy law firms. For example, with Lenox Hill, they're using a law firm that's alleged to use process servers that falsify their service of process. In a federal court action, they're alleged to basically use a process server that pretends to serve patients, but they really don't. And then they wonder why all the hospital lawsuits are won based on default. That means that the patient never shows up in court. And if the very, very few that do get their pleadings and are served, when they do show up, you know, they're never having lawyers because they can't afford it. What are we doing here as a society? We need to make demands. And, you know, our political leaders need to step up and make demands and say these lawsuits should be never events. We need to have fair and transparent billing. Most patients don't understand their bills. Consumer Reports did a survey and found that a third of patients pay bills they don't even think they owe because they're so afraid of having an adverse event on their credit report. It's out of control, and we need to demand more from our nonprofit hospitals.
Elizabeth,
well, you mentioned Lenox Hill Hospital, which is part of the Northwell chain, headed by Michael Dowling, a very close friend and ally of Governor Cuomo. Where is the governor on these issues these days?
We have met with the administration several times, and we worked. I co-chaired a committee on indigent care that the governor impaneled a couple of years ago, and there were some reforms made on that charity care pool, that indigent care pool, and so that was a great thing that the governor did. In his State of the State, he said and promised that he would have one unified financial aid form that every single hospital must use in New York State. That is yet to be materialized. And so we've gone to the legislature and said, hey, we need one simple uniform financial aid form. So every hospital in New York State, there's over 200, gets to design their own financial aid form. And if you've seen one financial aid form, you've seen one. In Lenox Hill's case, you can't even find the financial aid form on their website. You have to know exactly what to be looking for. And after like 4 clicks, maybe you'll make it to the Northwell, the mothership website, where you might be able to find their financial aid policies. They make it as hard as possible to apply for financial aid. And we've never seen a lawsuit where they actually said that they offered financial aid and found that the patient was not eligible.
Elizabeth,
so we need massive reform here.
I wanted to ask you about the distinction in hospitals, because people might lump them all together. You've got the so-called not-for-profit hospitals, the private hospitals. Then I'm looking at a piece by Politico. New York safety net hospitals were the front lines of the coronavirus. Now they're facing ruin. So compare them, like Lenox Hill, Northwell, etc., to New York City hospitals that serve the city's poorest patients facing financial ruin after being on the front lines.
Well, that's one of the things that we did a big report in the middle of the summer, because the original allocation of the CARES Act funding was based on commercial insurance practices, your past performance in terms of getting receipts from commercial carriers. So, you know, New York Presbyterian originally and Northwell were getting hundreds and hundreds of millions, and Health and Hospitals, which has a much smaller commercial insured base of business, was getting tiny amounts. That was eventually corrected towards the end of the year, where the big safety net institutions, they ended up sort of rejiggering the pool. But the idea that the federal government thought it was okay to allocate hospital relief packages based on commercial insurance performance and not based on Medicaid performance, for example, is crazy-making, especially given the fact that the pandemic had such a disparate impact on low-income communities of color, where our beloved essential workers live and work. That was sorry.
Keep going.
No, go ahead. That was sorted out eventually, and I think the allocation, by the time we re-reviewed it in the end of December, early January, it looked like it was sort of right-sized. But it's interesting, going back to our indigent care pool that New York State gives out, the $1 billion to support the provision of charity care, that was never allocated as it should have been to the top 25% of safety net hospitals, of which our public hospitals are all part of, and in fact have been spread around like peanut butter to these hospitals that are so-called charities that are suing the pants off of patients. So there's something deeply wrong. I don't believe that one charitable hospital who's suing a patient should be getting any indigent care pool funding, because clearly they aren't actually following the letter of the law and really getting the financial aid out to the patients that need it.
Elizabeth, before we go, there's 2 critical issues, and we only have a few minutes. One is, we did that first segment on especially undocumented essential workers getting aid. What's the situation in New York and in California for undocumented people getting health care? And then if you could briefly address the expansion of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think most people know this. Who has access to Obamacare, depending on their wealth or not wealth?
Sure. So two things. The first thing on immigrant health, like the essential workers, New York State really fumbled in its budget this year. Our leaders, we had put together a package of $20 million, just $20 million to provide coverage to undocumented immigrants who have COVID. That was unacceptable to our state lawmakers, and that did not pass in our state budget where they're raising billions in revenue. So that's just a total abdication of leadership by all our lawmakers, and we're completely upset about that. In terms of the Affordable Care Act, this is quite extraordinary what the Biden administration did. They did 4 things that really help people right now. Number one, if you're getting coverage through the marketplace, you are eligible for more financial assistance. So you should immediately go back onto the marketplace and re-estimate your tax credits. Number 2, you for higher income people are now eligible for financial aid. So if you ever applied for financial assistance through the marketplace and were turned down because of your income, go back. You might be eligible now. Number 3, if you get even one unemployment check in 2021, you can get a 0 premium plan right now that's super good, a platinum level plan. And number 4, they were totally paying for COBRA subsidies between April and September. You get free, the government will pay for your COBRA payments. Insurance premium payments. That's when you get terminated from your job or you lose your job. You get the offer of insurance, your job-based insurance. You can get the government to pay for your premiums between April and September 2021. So the Biden package, America Rescue Plan, has really done a lot on health coverage for Americans, and we're super grateful to the administration for that.
And where can people go to get this information?
You can go to, if you're in a federal, you can go to healthcare.gov, or if your state, many states run their own marketplace, and you should go to your own state marketplace and call the call centers. They're standing by. They can help you. You can also go to a local navigator that's a real person that can, is your champion and can help you sort through all of this.
Elizabeth Benjamin, we want to thank you for being with us, Vice President of Health Initiatives at the Community Service Society of New York, co-founder of Healthcare for All New York campaign. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll look at President Biden's infrastructure plan. Stay with us.
Buildings and bridges are made to bend in the wind to withstand the world. That's what it takes. All that steel and stone are no match for the air, my friend. What doesn't bend breaks. What doesn't bend breaks.
Buildings and Bridges by Ani DeFranco. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is calling for a minimum global corporate income tax to help pay for President Biden's proposed $2.25 trillion infrastructure and jobs plan. Yellen spoke at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Monday.
Another consequence of an interconnected world has been a 30-year race to the bottom on corporate tax rates. President Biden's proposals announced last week call for bold domestic action, including to raise the U.S. minimum tax rate and renewed international engagement, recognizing that it's important to work with other countries to end the pressures of tax competition and corporate tax base erosion. We're working with G20 nations to agree to a global minimum corporate tax rate that can stop the race to the bottom.
Treasury Secretary Yellen's remarks come as part of a broader push by the Biden administration to promote the president's proposed infrastructure plan. During a speech Friday, Biden criticized corporations that fail to pay taxes, that pay no taxes at all.
This is an economic opportunity for those who've helped build the country and have been ignored or neglected for much too long by our government. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in our economic future, a chance to win the future, paid for by asking big corporations, many of which do not pay any taxes at all, just to begin to pay their fair share.
To talk more about Biden's $2.2 trillion infrastructure proposal and his plans to fund it, we're joined by Derek Hamilton, professor of economics at the New School, where he's also founding director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy. He served as economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Professor Hamilton, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you assess this infrastructure plan, everything from highways and failing bridges to elder care and child care and racial justice issues that people don't usually associate with an infrastructure proposal?
I mean, the good news is the conception of infrastructure has been expanded to include human infrastructure as well as addressing the environment. So, you know, beyond just traditional bridges and roads, which are in dire need of investment in America, we're also talking about in trying to make it so that people can have access to care, and further that those workers who deliver that care receive adequate wages, adequate benefits, and work in adequate working conditions. That's an example. There's also a great amount of investment directed at improving our environment, as well as public infrastructure like broadband access, making sure that everyone has access to the broadband in the 21st century. Those are some of the really good things in the bill.
Oh, well, Professor, but what about some of these details? Because we're talking about sums of money unheard of in the past in terms of this kind of government aid, $100 billion for high-speed broadband. How would that work? Is this going to be for the actual infrastructure, or is this going to be for subsidizing broadband costs for customers, which would in essence mean giving more money to the broadband companies? How would this work? Do you know?
Yeah, now, of course, devil's in the detail. And then when you lead with sum of money, we always have to put actual dollar values in perspective. We need to think about things like share of GDP that's being invested, as opposed to the actual shock value of the number that's presented. And in the bill, he talks about 1% of GDP going towards total investment. And Juan, as you point out, we need to think about, are we talking about public-private partnerships, or are we talking about direct public provisions? So, you know, we led with some of the good and some of the ways in which it can be improved. The scale is inadequate. If we're talking about addressing our vulnerability to climate change and any type of natural disasters, the scale needs to be larger than $2 trillion. And then also, if we're talking about ensuring that there's adequate protection for workers, thinking about public-private partnerships have not always worked in the past, that we need a public sector that directly competes with the private sector. That's another way of intervening that could benefit workers directly. But again, it's mixed, because there's provisions in the bill to promote unionization. There are provisions to promote equity. But in addition to direct public options for jobs, direct public jobs, we also need to make sure that that equity that's proposed in the bill has accountability, that there are metrics to measure how well we're doing in delivering racial justice, tribal justice. And then if we're failing in delivering that equity, that there's some pathway towards accountability to rectify that failing.
And could you talk somewhat about this, the Biden proposal to increase the corporate tax rate as a means of paying for some of this, and also this more recent announcement that the federal government is going to try to seek a global corporate minimum tax, something that obviously will take years of negotiations with the countries of the world to come up with something like that if it ever does come to fruition?
That's a fantastic provision in the bill also. One can think of this bill as two parts. One is the public infrastructure, and the other is, and here's the adjective I would describe rather than a corporate tax hike, a restoration of the corporate tax rate back to, not even back to our historic levels, but back to prior to the Trump administration and some of the other administrations. So I guess he's calling for a 28% corporate tax rate, and in calling for that 28% tax rate, including provisions to avoid loopholes for savvy accountants at corporations that are able to skate that 28% responsibility. And what's more, as you point out, Juan, Secretary Yellen pointed out in the beginning of this segment that there's also the race to the bottom by recognizing that corporations are transnational and they pit countries, nation states against one another. So putting a base level tax rate at a minimum avoids that race to the bottom and corporations being able to bid one nation state against the other. Another way to conceive of this is think of it as not only an industrial policy, but even a trade policy through tax reform to make sure that we have fair standards when we think about ways in which nation states engage across borders.
Hamilton, progressives are continuing to call for an even greater investment in infrastructure projects. This is New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking on MSNBC last week.
We're talking about realistically $10 trillion over 10 years. And I know that may be an eye-popping figure for some people, but we need to understand that we are in a devastating economic moment. Millions of people in the United States are unemployed. We have a truly crippled healthcare system and a planetary crisis on our hands, and we're the wealthiest nation in the history of the world.
Can you respond to that and lay out your vision of what infrastructure project, program, bill, law, promoting racial equity should look like? You write about this all the time.
The Congresswoman is, as usual, spot on in thinking about the scale of the problem and the size of the bill is incongruent. And again, Juan, you led with that $2 trillion figure, but if put in perspective, if we understand the gross inequities where the top 0.1% has as much of the nation's wealth as the bottom 90%, and then if we add the dimensions of race and gender, where one's race is more predictive of one's economic circumstance than their class itself, and by class, I mean education or even job that you work at, that's a problem. And that's going to require an investment well beyond what's being proposed. And if we think about our environment and what we're going to need to shore up our resiliency to not only climate change, but the next pandemic, it's going to require something more in the order of what the Congresswoman has proposed. And then, even framing. Ultimately, we need public provisions that are more direct. Some of the approaches of using tax incentives and using public-private partnerships, we don't have to do away with those. They have their place. But what we really need is a rebalance of power where the public sector is exercising their might in a way to avoid, just like we're talking about race to the bottom across borders, race to the bottom in labor markets. If we have direct jobs where an individual can choose to go work in the private sector with proper conditions, with proper wages, that in and of itself will discipline the private sector. I call for a federal job guarantee. That is a direct way to ensure that every worker literally has a job that desires to have a job at an adequate wage with proper benefits. And it not only gives that worker a direct job, those workers that aren't in the public sector, they would be able to better bargain where they are for better wages, and et cetera. And I'll give one quick example. I know we're running short on time. If you are a waitress putting up with sexual harassment at your job, or a black man or black woman being discriminated in your job, you have less agency to deal with that if you don't have an alternative. And what building up the public sector employment can do is provide that alternative, and then also provide it in a way that's building our public infrastructure that goes directly to the public in areas that frankly, the private sector is not adequately producing, such as making our environment more resilient.
On that note, I want to thank you for being with us. Derek Hamilton, professor of economics at the New School, founding director of its Institute on Race and Political Economy. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for a senior news producer to join our team here in New York City. You can learn more and apply today at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnock, Trina Nadura, Ham Alkoff, Tay Maria, Studio John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.